Hello. You will forgive me for combining Emilia and Desdemona together in this conference. But I think you'll see quickly why it makes sense for me to do this way. So congrats on picking either one of these ladies to write on. I think both are going to give you lots to be able to say and argue in terms of the so what. So good choice. So let's start out by thinking about these two women. And the first thing you want to think about is, are they dynamic? And meaning, do they change over the course of the play, or are they static? Do they remain unchanged? And I think with both women, you could argue that they do change. And the women that we meet in the early part of the play, Act 1, Act 2, it's not the same person exactly that we meet or that we encounter at the end of the play. And these two women actually seem to go in opposite directions in terms of characterization. So think about this with me for a moment. So if we're picking Emilia, let's think about ways we would describe Emilia when we first meet her. When we first meet Emilia, she's getting picked on by her husband, Iago, and she's kind of quietly taking it. And by that, I mean, she's like, hey, but she doesn't really challenge him in front of anyone. She is pretty obedient, pretty compliant. She takes the handkerchief for him because he's asked her to get it. She doesn't really ask any questions. And so she starts out pretty obedient, pretty stereotypically female early in the play. But as the play progresses, I would argue that she transfers her allegiance from Iago, loyalty to Iago, to loyalty more to her friend Desdemona. And as she becomes more linked to Desdemona and more upset witnessing, sometimes we recognize in other people's relationships some of the things we'd rather not recognize in our own. I think she begins to kind of feel bad for Desdemona in the way her husband starts to treat her in an abusive way, verbally and then later physically. And so Emilia, I would argue, by Act 3, Act 4, becomes more bold. And then finally, she's the hero of the play. I mean, without her, Iago gets away with it. She becomes brave. So something like, throughout the course of the play, Shakespeare shows Emilia evolve from initially compliant to become more bold, and finally to become brave by the end of the play. What do we make of that characterization? Through this characterization, is Shakespeare challenging sexist attitudes of the time? Remember, Emilia is of a lower class than Desdemona, so some of the things she does, she's kind of gets away with, so to speak, because she is from a lower class and the expectations aren't as high for her as they are of Desdemona. However, you cannot get away from the fact that this play allows Emilia to say some very strong things about the sexist environment in which Shakespeare is writing and producing these plays. And so a feminist view is not uncommon. While at the same time, we have the problem of Desdemona. So Desdemona and Emilia seem to pass each other. One's going this way, the other's going that way. Where Emilia finishes very strong and independent and brave, Desdemona starts that way, right? She casts off everything she knows to go be with Othello. She's loving and independent and strong and powerful. And over the course of the play, where does that go? Where does that go? I mean, once Othello starts acting jealous and different, she becomes quieter and more obedient. By the end of the play, and in the film version, if you just relied on the film version, they didn't do it. But in the text, she actually wakes up for a moment and says, I did it myself. I choked myself. It wasn't Othello. She's taking blame and showing love, which is very admirable. but she allowed her killer, her husband, to, at least in theory, get away with the crime. I mean, how much more troublesome could that depiction be of a woman who's been murdered by her husband, then taking the blame for it? It was my fault. I did it myself. And so for every moment that Emilia might be challenging sexist attitudes, what do we do with Desdemona? So there's a couple ways we can go with her. One, we can say Shakespeare is a product of his time and he's unable to think that far out of the box for women as far as their characterization, and he shows the limits of his own imagination when it comes to characterizing women as strong and independent. Another statement that could be made is that Desdemona becomes almost a caricature or a satire of the compliant, obedient wife. Now, if she is seen that way, then Shakespeare is still using her to kind of expose some of the some of the sexist attitudes around, and saying, like, this is what society does to strong women. This is what society does to women who have their own minds. This is what men do to women, since Othello is full of guilt for everything that happens to her. So you're going to really have to think it through, and think about whether you've chosen Emilia or whether you've chosen Desdemona. What are the strengths of the challenge that Shakespeare issues to the sexist system, and what are some of the ways he falls short, if any? Okay, so you got to think about that, if that's going to be your so what. Again, it could be something like, through his characterization of Desdemona throughout the play, from initially independent to more compliant and ultimately obedient, we see Shakespeare satirically mock the expectations for women during the time. Or through the transformation of Desdemona from initially independent to ultimately quiet and obedient, we see Shakespeare offering a sexist view of women during the time. Something like that. Okay, so you're going to have to think that through. You definitely want to stick to one of these women. Do not write a paper about both of them. You will never be able to fit it in 3 to 5 pages. The other thing you'll want to do is make sure you locate some research on Desdemona or Emilia. And I've posted some sample essays that might give you some clues if you're having a hard time. You could pop down to the library. There's at least a couple essay collection books in our library on Othello and the characters in there. Also, the online resources are pretty good, so you should be able to find something. But really, the main engine of this paper is your response to the character, your analysis, and your argument. And the critic should be used just to support in some way. Okay? So good luck, and I can't wait to check out your paper. See ya.